Thank you. Good morning. I would first like to thank Professor Li Fuyin for his invitation to me to teach at this distinguished university, and not only at this university, but specifically also in a nation that has cherished the value of learning as part of its cultural heritage. And my little motto there is there to remind you of that heritage, if that is necessary at all. What I would like to do in my talks is to go through a number of aspects of what I will be calling cognitive sociolinguistics. And basically that is going to be an introduction to variationist studies of language variation within the framework of cognitive linguistics. So we will be studying language internal variation from a social and a historical point of view, with a specific focus, a specifically cognitive linguistic focus on meaning and categorization. And to give you a rough overview of what the talks will include. So there are 10 talks, and they're basically structured in following 5 sections. The first 2 talks, so today's talks, are of an introductory kind. Then the next 2 for tomorrow will deal with what I will call semasiological variation, and we'll see later what that implies. Okay? Then the next 2 talks, or the next 4 talks in a sense, are about onomasiological variation. Again, that's something to explain what exactly that includes. But we make a distinction there between conceptual onomasiological variation and then formal onomasiological variation. And then the final talk is a conclusion. So the introduction consists of first a historical overview of the social turn in cognitive linguistics, that is to say, the growing importance of sociolinguistic, cultural linguistic studies within cognitive linguistics. And then the second talk introduces all this difficult terminology that I mentioned in this overview, things like semasiological and onomasiological variation. So that's the second talk for today, types of semantic and categorial variation. And then the second 2 talks first have a look at things from a historical point of view. That's the diachronic prototype semantics talk for tomorrow. And then from the point of view of linguistic norms, that's the 4th talk on stereotypes, prototypes, and norms. The next 2 then are about, or illustrate this concept of conceptual onomasiological variation by looking at the cultural history of metaphors, and further by looking at cultural models of language variation. The next 3 talks illustrate formal onomasiological variation. I will be talking about lexical variation, about measuring lexical variation, and then about multivariate models of linguistic variation. What does it mean when we bring all that together into some kind of model of the grammar? And then, of course, we have a conclusion. I should also say that a lot of what I will be presenting is not my individual work, but it's work that has been done by my research team in Leuven, the quantitative lexicology and variational linguistics team. So a lot of what I will present has been developed first in PhD theses, for instance, that were presented in Leuven. Okay, and now let's really get started with the first talk. Contextualization and the social turn in cognitive linguistics. Oh yes, as a practical point, I should perhaps also say that I'm not entirely sure of the timing of the talks. I will try to leave time for questions at the end of the talk. But if there's not enough time for questions at the end of this talk, I might leave some more time at one of the other talks, and then we can bring together the questions that have to do with several lectures. Cognitive linguistics as a theoretical approach in linguistics has a history of roughly 30 years. So the question I want to introduce now is the following. Is there a unifying factor behind the development of cognitive linguistics? And if we can identify such a factor, in which direction could cognitive linguistics develop in the future? And what I will try to make clear to you is that an increasing attention for social factors in language is part of the, let's call it the natural development, the spontaneous development of cognitive linguistics. So that's the line that I will develop in this talk. And in practice, that means that I will first present a brief overview of the history of cognitive linguistics, situate cognitive linguistics in the context of the history of linguistics, and then identify the major underlying trends in the development of cognitive linguistics. And obviously, as you can imagine, a turn towards the social aspects of meaning and language is part of those underlying trends. And then I'll draw some conclusions on the basis of that analysis. So, the steps in the talk for today are, at least for this morning, are the following. First, we have this historical overview, 30 years of cognitive linguistics. Then I'm sketching the wider context, and that's going to be, in a sense, in a highly simplified sense, a history of 20th century linguistics, if you wish. And then we'll situate the specific position of cognitive linguistics against that background as what I will call a recontextualizing approach. Basically, keep this in mind. What I will try to show is that in the history of linguistics, in the larger sense, you have a tendency to deny the context of language, to decontextualize language. And then cognitive linguistics is one of the approaches that recontextualizes language. And you already understand that looking at the social context of language is then one aspect and a crucial aspect of that recontextualizing tendency. So that's the underlying argument, if you wish. Okay. If we think about the history of cognitive linguistics of the last 30 years, you can roughly indicate a number of landmarks, a number of important dates. If we take the period in the middle of the 1970s, we can find the early beginnings of cognitive linguistics. There is Len Tolmy's work on figuring ground, which dates from 1975. There is Ron Lanaker's work on cognitive grammar, which was first being formulated in the mid-1970s. And George Lakoff's move towards what he then called Gestalt linguistics also dates from that period. So around 1970, or at least in the middle of the 1970s, we can see the first seeds, if you wish, of what we now know as cognitive linguistics. So that's the first step. Then if we move 10 years on to the second half of the 1980s, we get a very important step in the development of cognitive linguistics, because that is the point when cognitive linguistics really enters the international scene. Specifically, we have a number of publications there that we still refer to today as, if you wish, foundational texts. And some other things happened at that point that indicate that we get an international expansion of at that point of cognitive linguistics. So, for instance, we have Ron Lanaker's Foundations of Cognitive Grammar in 1987, George Lakoff's Women, Fire and Dangerous Things also in the same year. Then a very important collective volume of papers was published in 1988 by Brigida Rutzka-Austin. In 1989, we had the first International Cognitive Linguistics Conference, which was still a fairly small event at that time. And in 1989, we launched the journal Cognitive Linguistics. So in that period, the second half of the 1980s, you can see that cognitive linguistics becomes international. And then a further step starts happening, let's say, some 10 years ago, when you see that cognitive linguistics has consolidated itself into a really international movement. And when a theory, when an approach becomes consolidated like that, it's usually fairly easy to see how it happens, because you see the emergence, the publication of a number of textbooks and reference works. And on another sociological level, what you also see is that that you have an expansion, a sociological expansion of the framework, and in this case that takes the form of the foundation of a number of national affiliates of the International Cognitive Linguistics Association. So to briefly go through a number of these things, the affiliates, for instance, Spain was one of the first to set up a national Cognitive Linguistics Association in 1989, and one of the most recent ones is the Chinese one, which was founded in 2006. So you see that apart from the already existing International Cognitive Linguistics Association, you get a number of, if you wish, regional ones or localized ones, national ones. And then for handbooks, just to show that we have a whole series of books that consolidate the knowledge that we have of cognitive linguistics. There's the Ungerer and Schmidt book of 1996, Dirk and Verspoor in 1998, Violi 2001, Croft and Cruz 2004, Evans and Green 2006, a volume with basic readings that I edited in 2006, and an accompanying volume with contemporary chapters on the contemporary situation, edited by Gita Christiansen, and another voluminous handbook of cognitive linguistics published by myself and my colleague Hubert Kuykens in 2007. So overall, if we summarize that, what you can see is that we go from a pioneering stage in the first decade, from 1977 to roughly 87. Then we get an expansion stage in the next decade, and what I will call a consolidation stage. Well, I'm ending here in 2007, but of course we still go on. That could be 2009. So we have these three major stages in the theoretical and sociological development of cognitive linguistics. So the question is, what are the theoretical developments accompanying the sociological expansion? And in terms of content, so we've seen what happens in terms of practical activities, in terms of localization, in terms of international presence, but what happens in terms of theory? And if we can see what happens in terms of theory, what might be the fourth stage? Now, this is a very difficult question, and I'm not really going to go into that. I'm not going to make myself guilty of predictions of a kind that could hardly be verified at this moment. So I won't pay a lot of attention to that. But what has been happening internally in terms of theory? Well, to see what has been happening, I first want to cast the net even a bit wider and have a look at the evolution of linguistics in the larger sense. What happens, or what happened in linguistics in the 20th century? And what happened before cognitive linguistics became part of this evolution of 20th century linguistics? So what I want to claim is that we can get a very good grip on the evolution of linguistics in the 20th century if we keep in mind, or if we see that there are three stages in this development of 20th century linguistics. We first get a decontextualization stage. Then we get a period in which we get a number of initial reactions to the decontextualizing movement, and then we get what I call the what I call the recontextualization movement. Okay, and then the claim will be that cognitive linguistics is the movement, or at least one of the movements that, in a sense, epitomizes, that really embodies this recontextualizing tendency. So let's start at the, no, this is not going to work. So let's start at the very beginning of 20th century linguistics, or at least what is usually recognized as such. There is, of course, also a history of 19th century linguistics, which is very important. And if you can stay with me until lecture 9 and lecture 10, then you will see that I will also at one point go back to 19th century linguistics, because one of the things that I will claim at the very end of this series of 10 talks is that some of the things that are happening at this point in linguistics actually mirror, actually reflect to a large extent a number of things that were happening in the 19th century. But for the moment, let's stick to the 20th century. The 20th century is interesting enough from the point of view of linguistics. So what is usually recognized as the beginning of 20th century linguistics is the work by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. And a crucial aspect of the teachings of de Saussure is that you have to make a distinction between two levels of language. The level of structure, langue in French, which is language as a social system, right? As a collective set of coded conventions. A cultural thing, if you wish, a cultural code. On the other hand, there is the level of linguistic usage, which then in de Saussure's French terminology is known as parole. And that is the level where you have language as an individual psychological activity. So on the one hand, you have the code, the set of symbols that you can use, if you wish. On the other hand, you have the actual usage of those symbols by combining them, right? By putting them together, and then you have something like a sentence or a message or whatever. Now, in this system, where you make the distinction between langue and parole, between structure and use, there is a missing link. There is a missing link because there is one question that de Saussure does not answer, namely, where is the individual's knowledge of the system? On the one hand, you have the system, which is described by de Saussure as something social, something collective. On the other hand, there is the individual activity, putting things together to make a sentence. But implicitly, if you have the second thing, if you have the activity of the individual, there is something in between. There is something between the collective code and the individual activity, and that is the knowledge of the individual. An individual speaker cannot use the linguistic code unless the individual has knowledge of the code. So there is, if you wish, in a sense, a cognitive gap in the Saussurian system. What is the cognitive bridge between the social code and the individual activity? So if I'm expressing that graphically, we can put it in this way. Note that this is a representation that I will be using a lot in the rest of this talk. The rest of this talk is to some extent a variation or an expansion, a modulation of this graphical representation here. So on the one hand, we have langue as the social system, and on the other hand, we have parole as individual activity, and then there's a question mark in the middle. Where is the individual system? Where is the knowledge that the individual has of the social system, in the sense that that knowledge enables the individual to use the social system? Now, of course, up to a point, that's not a difficult question. If you ask the question, where is the knowledge of the individual? Well, we can assume that an individual has knowledge, right? An individual has knowledge because he's learned the language, because he's learned the social code. So in itself, it's not a question that is so difficult to answer, it would seem. The knowledge of the individual is something that an individual acquires by being a member of a social group, the social group that uses the language. So in itself, it's not so difficult. Only from a theoretical point of view, as we will see, this is very important for the evolution of linguistics in the 20th century. I mean, the gap in the Saussurian system is very important. In what sense? Well, if we shift towards what we can perhaps call the second major revolution in 20th century linguistics, the emergence of Saussurian structuralist grammar is the first revolution, or the first important step. So the second step is the emergence of generative grammar, of the Chomskyan framework. And now what is very important in the Chomskyan approach is precisely that Chomsky focuses on this missing link, right? On the question mark in the initial system. And if you think of the terminology that is used by Chomsky, you will immediately understand why we can say that, because one of the things that Chomsky introduced was this notion of competence. And it was a crucial notion, an essential notion for the Chomskyan framework. What is competence? Well, competence, as defined by Chomsky, is precisely the individual's knowledge of the language. So precisely the thing where we had the question mark in the graphical representation a moment ago. So that is where the gap is filled. Okay, so far so good. Nothing specific seems to be happening. This is precisely what we would expect. There is something missing in the overall picture and someone fills it in. Fine. But, and this is now where the problem, or some kind of problem in the evolution of 20th century linguistics emerges. Chomsky introduces another gap. He introduces, or he creates, another hiatus. In what sense? Well, what we would expect, of course, given our initial representation here, is that we get a system with three parts, with three aspects. That we would have something, that we would have a model of the language that takes into account the social aspects of language, the individual cognitive aspect of language, and then the individual activity as language usage. That's what we would expect. That's what we would have liked Chomsky to do. But that's not exactly what happened in reality. In reality, Chomsky forgets, well, not even forgets, well, let's first say he forgets about the social aspects of language, the code aspects of language. And he not only forgets about them, he denies their importance quite explicitly. So instead of a system with 3 components, we are again left in Chomskyan grammar with a system with only 2 components. So the question mark, or the gap, if you wish, shifts position. In the Chomskyan approach, it's only the individual's knowledge of the system and then the individual activity that get into the picture, that are in focus, but the social aspects of language are not deemed relevant. So you see overall how the various terminologies, or in a sense how the 2 binary terminologies relate to each other. You have langue and parole in the case of the Saussure, so the social aspect and the individual usage. In the Chomskyan approach, you get competence and performance, again a binary distinction. And the competence aspect of Chomsky fills in the gap that was left in the Saussurean system. But in the Chomskyan system, you see a new gap arising on the side of the social aspects, on the social code of language. And this overall situation, this overall model of what Chomskyan generative grammar does, has tremendous consequences. There's enormous consequences precisely because generative grammar was so very popular from the 1960s onwards. And what are the consequences? Well, let's ask the question now, within the Chomskyan framework, where does an individual's knowledge of the language come from? Because in the Saussurean system, it would be easy to do in the way in which we explained it a moment ago. In a Saussurean system, you can say, okay, if language is something that is essentially also a collective thing, a collective code, then an individual may learn the language by being immersed in a culture, right? By interaction with other people. But if you forget about the social aspects of language, if you, in a sense, even deny their importance, and at the same time focus on the individual knowledge of the language, on competence, then of course the question is, where does the competence come from? Or in other words, if the source of linguistic knowledge is not social interaction or whatever, what is it? And that's, of course, where the generativist answer, or the generative focus on the innateness of language comes from, on the inborn genetic aspects of language. Because the knowledge of the language, if it's not social, well, then it must be genetic. There's hardly any other option. It must be inborn. If you don't learn it by interacting with other people, it must have been there in some form or another from the very start. Now, once you get that, once you see the connection between denying in the overall model of the grammar the importance of the social aspects of language and at the same time focusing on individual competence, then you can also see that there is a stepping stone development in generative grammar which leads by an internal logic to an isolation of the grammar. An isolation of the grammar in the sense of uncoupling the grammar from everything that is in the context. So let me try to spell out how this goes in a logical way. We've already reached the conclusion that we already understand that if language is not social, and if the knowledge of an individual's or the source of an individual's knowledge of language cannot be social, then it has to be genetic, okay? And then language will be seen primarily as something that is inborn, or at least that some aspects of language are inborn. Now, if the crucial thing about language is its genetic origin, then it's not very likely that the lexical or the semantic aspects of language are very important. Because if we think of meaning in language, then meaning is meaning and vocabulary, the lexical aspect of language, well, those are the aspects of language that we can most easily see as historically variable and culturally variable. The categories that we use in language are specific to the language, specific to the culture, specific to a region, and so on. So there's a lot of variability there that has a social background. So if you focus on the genetic aspects of language, you're not likely to focus on the semantics and certainly not on the vocabulary. So that already restricts the scope of the grammar. Now, if what is important in the grammar is not the semantics or the words, simply, then language will be about formal rule systems. Syntactic rules that are conceived of from a formal way, because the semantics is not deemed very important. And if studying language is then not, is about the formal rule systems in the language, then there's another restriction, because then the application of the rules becomes fairly trivial. That is to say, even within the Chomskyan approach, the distinction between competence and performance is asymmetrical in the sense that it's competence that is all important and not performance in the sense of using the language. So, this neglect of the social aspects of language that we started off with leads to a decontextualization of the grammar. There are aspects of the grammar, perspectives, parts of language that are, in a sense, thrown out. That are thrown out because this focus on the genetic aspects of language makes them unimportant. I can represent that graphically by coming back to the basic graphical representation that we had. So we had social code and performance to the left and to the right. But then what's in the middle? Well, in the middle, there we had the individual's knowledge of the language. And we can now specify that in the Chomskyan way of thinking about things as the grammar. Right? That's the real grammar, the individual's knowledge of the grammar. That's what's in the middle. Okay, but if this is the full picture that we would like to see, language as a social thing, language as individual knowledge of the language, and language as using the language, then what is left of this full picture in the generativist framework? Well, lots of things are being thrown out and cut off in the following sense. First, we remove the social code. That was the first form of neglect that we had. Then, we also saw a moment ago that performance becomes unimportant because the focus is on the rule systems, not on how the systems are, how the rules are used, but on the systems as such. And then within the grammar, we cut off meaning and lexicon. So in this Chomskyan approach to things, you get a restricted and isolated form of the grammar, or conception of the grammar. A restrictive strategy, the Chomskyan approach embodies a restrictive strategy that separates an autonomous, a genetically determined, innate, autonomous grammatical module from different forms of context. From the social context, from discourse, the discursive context of actual use, and from the cognitive context of meaning and experience of the language. So that is, this movement, this restrictive movement is what I want to refer to as the decontextualizing tendency in, say, mainstream linguistics of the second half of the 20th century. Well, maybe when we look back on this in a couple more decades, we will probably say that it's just in in a fairly brief period from 1960 to 1980 or so that this was really, really dominant. But still, it had an enormous impact on the evolution of linguistics, precisely because linguistics was becoming very popular in that period. So, a decontextualizing form of linguistics. Okay. Now we can come to the next step in the evolution. And ask ourselves what happens in reaction to this, this decontextualizing movement. Well, I would say that in those reactions, you get two stages. And a first stage, which I want to situate fairly roughly from 1960 to 1980, that is the stage where the discarded aspects of language, so the things that were thrown out, as we saw them a moment ago, are still not totally left out of the picture. They are being developed separately. That is to say, they are being developed by disciplines that are more or less independent of theoretical grammar. And then the next stage will be a development in which those aspects of language are again being reincorporated into the grammar itself. Okay? You see the difference on the one hand. So what Chomskyan grammar does is to throw out a number of things from the grammar. The things that are thrown out do continue to exist, but not as part of core linguistics when you study the grammar. And then later on, you get movements that reincorporate those things in, which is parallel to theoretical grammar of the generativist kind. It's studying language variation as a field in itself, not as part of the study of the structure of the grammar, for instance, but as a separate approach. Okay, these are just a few references to early works in sociolinguistics, which you are probably familiar with. Okay, the important thing to remember is here, sociolinguistics emerges, if in the picture that I'm drawing, but this is a bit exaggerated, but in the picture that I'm drawing, you could say sociolinguistics emerges as an answer to the generativist neglect of the social aspects of language and the neglect of variation. But it emerges in opposition to the grammar. Right? It emerges as a discipline in its own right and not as part of a variationist view of what grammar is. Something similar happens to the other two gray boxes here. If we think of performance, the aspect of language use, we again see something happening in this period from 1960 to 1980, namely we see the emergence of pragmatics. Pragmatics in various forms, more logical forms of pragmatics, text linguistics, discourse linguistics, and so on. Pragmatics emerges as an answer to the Chomskyan neglect of grammar. So we get, again, a few well-known or fairly well-known references to important works in pragmatics. And then on the side of semantics, we also see something happening in that way, because what we see in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, is the emergence of formal semantics. And formal semantics is also, or could at least be seen as one of those trends in linguistics that pick up some of the strands of investigation that were left dangling by generative grammar. What formal semantics does, in for instance, the Montague sense, is to pick up semantics and still stay within a formal framework. That's something that will be different in cognitive linguistics later on, but stay within a formal framework, but focus on the semantics, rather than say semantics is unimportant. No, formal semantics tries to develop a formal grammar that takes semantics as its starting point. So overall, what we see in this first period, in this first stage of reacting against the restrictive approach of generative grammar, is the emergence of forms of linguistics that do focus on the neglected parts, on the discarded parts, but that do so by developing theories on their own. Okay? So you could ask yourself the question here, okay, if you have the pink boxes there, okay, those are different forms of grammar or of linguistics, and in a sense they're all competing with generative grammar that is in this period situated in the middle. Okay? They're competing. In some cases that makes the story a bit more difficult, but that's not something that we need to go into here. In some cases, of course, there are more interactions with generative grammar than with others. For instance, if you take formal logical pragmatics, there is some form of interaction with generative grammar, and to some extent also with formal semantics. But let's not go into to those details. Let's keep the picture fairly simple for today. Oh, so what's going to happen next? Well, what we see happening now, well, I'm taking a broad view of what is now, actually. Now is, let's say, what's been happening since roughly 1980, probably. What we see is that we get growing dissatisfaction with the modular view of linguistics. Because if you go back to this picture, what you get is a very modular conception of the overall structure of linguistics. You get different forms of linguistics that focus on different aspects. But there's no integration of all that in one model of the language. Okay? You have one model of the language for syntax, and you have one model of the language for linguistic variation, for instance, but the two don't meet. Now, that's not a very satisfactory situation. So what we can see happening in the last 20 years is that, 20, 30 years, is that we again get integrational approaches that try to bring back the aspects that were discarded into the very study of grammar, into the very study of linguistic structure and linguistic knowledge. So the peripheral aspects that were being developed largely separately and autonomously are being linked up more narrowly with the grammar itself. And then, of course, you can no longer maintain that a grammar is an autonomous grammar. Okay? It's not an autonomous grammar, it's a grammar that is integrated with all the rest. Now, I should say quite explicitly that this is an integrational approach that is not restricted to cognitive linguistics. If you think of many forms of functional linguistics, for instance, they're all representing these attempts to reintegrate the peripheral aspects of the language into the study of the very structure of the language. But it's at the same time, I think that this reincorporating tendency is probably most radically represented within cognitive linguistics. I think cognitive linguistics is the most radical instantiation, most extreme instantiation of the recontextualizing trend in contemporary linguistics. And we can show this, and now I'm coming back to where I started. We can show this by having a look at the way in which the various aspects of context structure the internal historical development of cognitive linguistics. So you remember I started off by saying we have these three stages in the development of cognitive linguistics, but what happens theoretically? What happens in the descriptive expansion of cognitive linguistics? Well, if we look at the internal evolution of cognitive linguistics, we can see that the internal evolution is guided by the reincorporation of those peripheral aspects of the grammar. So let's have a look at that. So the question is, how does cognitive linguistics integrate the different facets of studying linguistics, studying language, that were discarded by the decontextualizing tendencies in modern linguistics? And we have the various aspects. We have meaning, we have lexicon, we have performance, usage, and we have the social aspects of language. So how do they play a role? So, next step, cognitive linguistics as a recontextualizing approach. First, obviously, cognitive linguistics has to do with recovering meaning for the grammar. How can we see this? Well, the very basic vocabulary of cognitive linguistics involves a set of concepts that all have to do with meaning. Things like prototype, schematic network, conceptual metaphor, metonymy, conceptual integration, idealized cognitive model, frame. All those things are semantic concepts, concepts that have to do with ways of describing meaning. So at the very core of cognitive linguistics is an attention for meaning in language. And this is probably where most of or this is at least where the initial attention of and for cognitive linguistics comes from. A new way of looking at meaning in language. Then we can also see that compared to generative grammar and many other forms of more formally oriented theories of grammar, there is a lot of attention in cognitive linguistics for the lexicon, not just from the point of view of meaning. That's the initial stage where we look at, if you think of prototype theory, for instance. I will be coming back to prototype theory in the talk this afternoon, but when you think of prototype theory, well, there's a direct attention for the lexicon because you look at the categories that are available in the vocabulary of a particular language. But it goes further than that. There is a lot of attention for the lexicon in the study of the syntax of the language. And this, at this point in the development, we find that most explicitly in construction grammars. What are construction grammars? Well, construction grammars are, in a sense, lexicalist approaches to syntax, to some extent. Lexicalist approaches in the sense that what are constructions? Well, constructions are syntactic entities that may consist of abstract categories, more abstract categories like word classes, for instance, together with lexically specific aspects. And constructions, even if they are totally abstract, that's another part of the lexicalization of syntax, have to be studied together with their lexical realization. And if we think at what syntactic constructions are from a semantic point of view, well, they exhibit all the same structural features as lexical categories. So even in the syntax, you see that there is a tendency to build the syntax on the model of the lexicon, in a sense, by looking at separate syntactic constructions as almost as if they were words. Then, very importantly, in contemporary cognitive linguistics, there is a recovery of performance. In what sense? Performance, or the level of performance, the level of usage. Well, first we have to see that from the very beginning of cognitive linguistics, there has been an interest in let's call it pragmatic meanings, of semantic phenomena that are situated on the level of discourse and actual usage. But that remained fairly, or if you wish, the performance-related aspect of that remained fairly implicit for a while. Now, more recently, this has importance of performance, the level of usage for cognitive linguistics, has become explicit by the introduction of this notion of a usage-based theory of grammar. There's also, but I won't go into that, a growing interest in applied cognitive linguistics. But the usage theory of grammar, what do people mean when they say that? Well, up to a point, the intention is, or the idea is that if we go back, if you wish, to some of the earlier representations here, like this one, then the idea is that the performance level, the level of actual linguistic usage, is essential for language. It's essential for language in various respects. For instance, if we come back to the question of acquisition, of learning a language, then it is crucial that we learn the language through using it, and using it in social interaction with other people. Also, when we look at the description of language, at the way in which we have to describe the language, and and the material we have, the methodology that we use in describing the language, then we can't describe the language without taking into account what people actually do when they use language. And a usage-based model of language will start from an inspection, an investigation into actual language use, actual language performance, and then try to deduce the structures and the patterns and the rules of the language. I'm insisting on this at this point because it's a point that I will have to come back to later on in the talks. It's a methodological point. A usage theory of language is a theory that, on the one hand, it says, so one aspect of it is to say, you have to include the study of performance, of discourse, of actual usage. You can't just study the abstract rules of the language in the abstract. Okay? But once you've taken that step, there's a crucial methodological consequence, which is that you will really have to start looking at what happens at the usage level. And so, for instance, it will become very important to use corpus materials to start doing corpus linguistics. Because what is a linguistic corpus as a collection of texts? Well, that's not a collection, that's a combination. That is a collection of texts, of instances of actual language usage. So if you claim that performance has to be incorporated into the model of the language, then you should really study performance. And if you study performance, then you will have to do some corpus linguistics, or maybe also experimental linguistics, but at least corpus linguistics, because that is where you will find your data on the actual use of language. So, to come back to the main story, we have in cognitive linguistics a recovery of the performance aspects. And then finally, the fourth aspect, we also see tendencies to recover the social context of language. And there are at this point two major tendencies that I would want to mention here. One is perhaps a more theoretically oriented one, which is the approach where people talk about situated embodiment and the socio-cultural background of meaning. That's what I want to summarize as biocultural linguistics. And Chris Sinha, who was one of the previous speakers in this forum, is a very good representative of that approach. These are people who say, okay, if we look at the semantic categories of the language, then those semantic categories have to be seen in their cultural context. Okay? And the other approach is rather a variationist approach, which links up more closely. So you could say that maybe the biocultural linguistics approach links up a lot with anthropology and anthropological linguistics, for instance, and with some forms of psychology. There's another form of recovering the social context in cognitive linguistics, which is the more variationist kind, where we look at different forms of lectal variation in the language. Now let me explain this term for a moment, because it's one that I will be using a lot in the course of the talks. Lectal variation is a term that I use to generalize over things like dialectal variation, regiolectal variation, sociolectal variation, and also register variation and stylistic variation. So a lect is any linguistic variety, any intralinguistic variety that you can think of. A dialect, a regiolect, a national variety of a language, a sociolect, a sociolinguistic variety, and so on. So the variationist form of cognitive sociolinguistics links up more with the sociolinguistic tradition, if you wish. And a good example of this trend is a volume that was edited by Geeraerts and René Devon last year, precisely with the title Cognitive Sociolinguistics. Now, I'm distinguishing these two approaches here. I'm not saying that there is an incompatibility between the two. On the contrary, there is a lot of overlap, and I won't make the distinction very clearly in the course of the following lectures. The following lectures will be situated specifically within the second approach, but there will be some references to the other one as well. So we can summarize this in this way. So to come back to our graphical representation, what do we see in the development of cognitive linguistics? Well, there is a reincorporation into the grammar of meaning and the lexicon, or at least of meaning, through the basic concepts of cognitive linguistics. There is a reincorporation of the lexicon, not just through the interest in categorization, but also in syntax, in this family of construction grammars that we have. There is a reintroduction of performance and the level of usage by thinking of cognitive linguistics as a usage-based grammar. And then there is a reintroduction of the social aspects of language, of the social code, through this development of a socio or even biocultural form of cognitive linguistics and variationist cognitive linguistics, so through cognitive sociolinguistics. So if we look at these recontextualizing tendencies within cognitive linguistics, we can certainly claim that in the context of contemporary linguistics, cognitive linguistics epitomizes, embodies in an extreme sense, the gradual recovery of the peripheral modules that were discarded by a decontextualizing approach to the grammar. And in the context of the internal development of cognitive linguistics, this recovery then takes the form of a gradual broadened phenomenon, as you would think in formal semantics, for instance. In formal semantics, meaning is still very much isolated. That's not the case in cognitive linguistics. When you think of meaning in cognitive linguistics, it's not isolated, it's integrated with other types of cognition. Just one or two examples. If you think of polysemy, the importance or the attention, the focus that has been going to the attention that has been going to the study of polysemy in cognitive linguistics, well, what does it mean? Polysemy emerges when one thing is seen in the context of something else, when one meaning arises as a modulation of an existing meaning. So that's a form of contextualization. If you think of another example, the importance of encyclopedic knowledge in cognitive linguistics, well, you have a number of basic concepts in cognitive linguistics. Well, of course, encyclopedic meaning is highly contextualized, and some of the basic concepts in cognitive linguistics have to do with ways of structuring and describing the encyclopedic aspects of meaning. So already in its basic concepts, cognitive linguistics is a contextualizing approach. And then in the usage usage-based approach or the usage-based conception of cognitive linguistics, we add another aspect of context. We add the discursive context in various forms by looking at the interplay between structure and use. Well, I'm not going to go into the examples here. By looking at the discourse function of items and the discourse grounding of constructions. So you broaden the context. And then, of course, and that's the point where we want to be for the rest of these talks, in biocultural cognitive linguistics, in variationist cognitive linguistics, in other words, in cognitive sociolinguistics, you add the social context of cultures and lectal variation. So, essentially, the underlying drift of cognitive linguistics in terms of its theoretical development consists of a systematic, stepwise recontextualization of the grammar. And we can even, I would claim, map this contextual expansion onto the chronological evolution of cognitive linguistics. In the sense that, you remember, I distinguished between this pioneering stage, a consolidation stage, and an expansion stage. Well, the pioneering stage and the consolidation stage focused largely on the basic concepts. The expansion stage was devoted to the broadening of the relevant notion of context. So some landmarks here again. Construction grammar emerges in the second half of the 1990s. Usage-based approaches, the terminology at least, is introduced in the first years of this millennium, and then the variationist approaches and the socio-linguistic approaches, as we've seen, are a more recent addition. They are coming to the fore in, well, the last few years, basically. So the theoretical expansion, the theoretical expansion of the notion of context, which means a recontextualization of the grammar, actually also seems to underlie the chronological steps in the evolution of cognitive linguistics. So let me draw some overall conclusions from this this first step in what I want to present from this historical overview of cognitive linguistics and to some extent even 20th century linguistics. So we've had the first 30 years in the evolution of cognitive linguistics. Is there a unifying factor behind the development of cognitive linguistics? Well, my answer to that question would be yes, if contemporary linguistics is indeed going through a phase of recontextualization after the Chomskyan decontextualization of the grammar, then cognitive linguistics represents that recontextualizing tendency more than any other contemporary approach in linguistics. And if that is the case, we could ask in what direction cognitive linguistics could develop in the future. Well, but this is anticipating on something that I will want to develop basically in lecture number 9 and lecture number 10. If we assume that factors like meaning and structure and discourse and lectal variation all co-determine grammatical phenomena, that is to say, if you don't study them separately, but if you study them as part of the grammar, then we will need a certain type of grammar to do this. It will have consequences for the type of linguistic description that we need to start from. And I will, in the course of the talks, I will gradually be moving to a model that I will call a multifactorial model of the grammar. A multifactorial model of the grammar where these various aspects of context that we just mentioned and that we went through, where they are all an aspect of the description of individual grammatical phenomena. But that is the, if you wish, or at least for these talks, that's the long-term perspective. So the first step I've taken now is to situate cognitive sociolinguistics, which we will focus on further in the other talks, to situate cognitive linguistics in the context of the evolution of cognitive linguistics at large and the evolution of 20th century linguistics. Okay, that's it for the first talk. There's now some 10 minutes for questions.